In the spring of 1944, inside a crowded military hospital where exhaustion had become routine and death rarely arrived for only one reason, a British nurse began noticing a pattern that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. The wounded arriving from different training camps did not share the same regiment, the same commanding officer, or even the same kind of injuries. Yet many carried nearly identical symptoms that did not belong together by chance. Doctors treated each case separately. Administrators filed reports and moved on. But one nurse quietly started writing down names, dates, and observations in a small notebook that had never been requested by anyone in authority. Her careful records would eventually expose an overlooked danger hidden inside the massive preparations for the Allied invasion of Europe. By the beginning of 1944, southern England had become one of the busiest military regions in the world. Roads that had once carried farmers and fishermen were now crowded with convoys of trucks, armored vehicles, ambulances, and military police. Railway stations operated almost continuously, unloading troops from every corner of Britain and from across the Commonwealth. American forces had also arrived in enormous numbers, filling temporary camps built across fields and woodlands. The countryside no longer resembled peacetime England. Every available building had been adapted for military use. Hospitals faced growing pressure long before the invasion itself began. Training accidents increased as thousands of inexperienced soldiers learned to operate unfamiliar equipment under demanding conditions. Medical personnel treated burns from vehicle fires, fractures sustained during obstacle courses, accidental gunshot wounds, infections caused by overcrowded camps, and respiratory illnesses that spread rapidly through barracks during the damp English spring. Among the nurses working inside one military hospital near Portsmouth was Staff Nurse Margaret Ellis, a member of Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. She had entered nursing several years before the war, expecting a career defined by ordinary hospital routines. Instead, conflict had transformed every aspect of her profession. By 1944, she had already cared for casualties evacuated from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. She had watched young men survive terrible wounds only to die from infection days later, and she had seen others recover against every expectation. Experience had taught her that medicine depended as much upon careful observation as it did upon treatment. Every morning began before sunrise. The wards came alive with the sound of footsteps, metal trolleys, and quiet conversations between exhausted nurses finishing the night shift. Temperatures were recorded. Dressings were changed. Medication rounds began. Surgeons reviewed overnight admissions while orderlies prepared patients for operations scheduled throughout the day. Each patient generated pages of paperwork. Military hospitals depended upon records almost as much as medicine itself. Every symptom, every treatment, every improvement or deterioration required documentation. Those files traveled with soldiers as they moved between hospitals or eventually returned to their units. Margaret Ellis developed a habit familiar to experienced nurses. She rarely accepted the first explanation for a patient's condition. If something appeared unusual, she remembered it. If several unusual details appeared together, she compared them. Most of the time the similarities meant nothing. Occasionally they meant everything. Late in April, several soldiers arrived following separate amphibious training exercises along England's southern coastline. Officially, they had suffered routine training accidents. One had fallen while climbing from a landing craft. Another had been struck by shifting equipment aboard a transport ship. A third had injured his shoulder when rough seas threw him against the side of an armored vehicle. Their injuries differed. Their symptoms did not. All complained of persistent headaches that had begun before the accidents occurred. Several displayed irritated eyes despite no evidence of chemical burns. Others developed dry coughs that gradually worsened after admission. One otherwise healthy corporal experienced unexplained dizziness severe enough that he struggled to remain standing even after treatment for his relatively minor injuries. Doctors suspected fatigue. The invasion preparations demanded exhausting schedules. Soldiers routinely spent long hours loading equipment, conducting rehearsals, and repeating exercises under strict time limits. Fatigue explained many complaints. Margaret accepted the diagnosis. At first. Then another convoy arrived. The patients came from an entirely different unit. Their injuries resulted from different incidents on another stretch of coastline. Yet several described nearly identical symptoms. Again there were headaches. Again there was persistent coughing. Again otherwise healthy young men appeared unusually exhausted before any visible injuries justified their condition. One private casually mentioned that he had developed a headache while waiting inside his truck before boarding a landing ship. Margaret noted the comment. Another patient recalled something similar several days later. He remembered dozens of vehicles sitting motionless for hours while engines continued running as troops waited for loading instructions. The observation seemed insignificant. Military vehicles often remained idling during embarkation procedures. Still, she remembered it. Her responsibilities left little time for curiosity. Every bed quickly filled after each major training exercise. Ambulances arrived throughout the day carrying soldiers from firing ranges, obstacle courses, engineering demonstrations, and coastal rehearsals. The hospital functioned almost like an assembly line, yet every patient required individual attention. One afternoon Margaret reviewed several temperature charts before noticing another coincidence. Patients with persistent respiratory irritation often recovered more slowly from otherwise minor wounds. Cuts remained inflamed longer than expected. Bruises faded more slowly. Fatigue lingered. She quietly retrieved admission records from previous weeks. Nothing in official procedure required such comparisons, but experienced nurses frequently consulted older files when unusual cases appeared. She found more similarities. Different regiments. Different counties. Different training schedules. One recurring detail. Nearly every patient had recently participated in amphibious exercises involving waterproofed military vehicles. The connection remained too weak for certainty. Still, she purchased a small notebook during one of her rare afternoons away from the hospital. It fit easily inside the pocket of her uniform. After finishing her official paperwork each evening, she copied only a few facts into its pages. Patient name, date of admission, unit, recent training location, reported symptoms. Nothing more. The notebook attracted no attention. Within 2 weeks, however, more than 20 names filled its pages. Patterns gradually emerged. Those arriving after ordinary infantry exercises rarely displayed the unusual respiratory complaints. Those evacuated from coastal rehearsals appeared repeatedly. Margaret knew enough about statistics to understand that coincidence became less convincing as numbers increased. She approached one of the junior medical officers responsible for overseeing admissions. Carefully, she explained that several recent patients seemed connected by symptoms rather than injuries. The doctor listened politely while reviewing a handful of files. Finally, he closed the folder. "The invasion preparations have doubled our workload," he said. "When thousands of men perform identical exercises, similar illnesses aren't unexpected." It was a reasonable conclusion. No argument followed. Margaret returned to her ward. Yet she did not stop writing. As May approached, preparations for the invasion intensified across southern England. Convoys became larger. Security tightened. Entire villages disappeared behind military checkpoints. Even hospital staff received instructions limiting conversations about troop movements and training locations. Casualties increased accordingly. One rainy evening, ambulances arrived almost continuously for more than 3 hours after rough weather disrupted another large-scale landing exercise. Most patients required only routine treatment. Several, however, immediately caught Margaret's attention. They displayed the same irritated eyes, the same persistent cough, the same unexplained headaches. One sergeant, while drifting in and out of sleep after receiving pain medication, quietly muttered to an orderly that everyone inside the vehicle had complained about the air before they even reached the beach. Margaret looked up from her notes. It was the third time she had heard nearly the same remark. This time, she underlined it in her notebook. By the end of the week, the evidence occupying those small handwritten pages no longer resembled scattered observations. It resembled the beginning of a question that nobody else inside the hospital seemed to be asking. The notebook remained hidden inside the pocket of Margaret Ellis's uniform as May 1944 moved toward its final weeks. She never intended it to become an official document. It was simply a collection of observations gathered during moments between dressing wounds, preparing medications, and completing endless medical records. Yet with every new admission, the pages became more difficult to dismiss. She spent evenings comparing dates instead of resting. The pattern grew clearer. Most of the affected soldiers had taken part in large amphibious rehearsals along England's southern coast. They belonged to different infantry divisions, engineer companies, transport units, and armored formations. Some had never met one another. They had trained on different beaches under different commanders. Their injuries varied. Their symptoms did not. Persistent headaches, red, irritated eyes, dry coughing that often became worse during the first 24 hours after admission, unusual fatigue that seemed out of proportion to relatively minor wounds. Several also complained of nausea that appeared before any physical injury had occurred. To many physicians, each symptom could be explained individually. Exhaustion was expected after long exercises. Sea air irritated the lungs. Poor sleep weakened recovery. Wartime medicine often required practical decisions rather than perfect answers. Margaret understood that reality. She also understood that medicine depended upon recognizing patterns before they became obvious. One afternoon, while helping prepare patients for surgery, she overheard two mechanics discussing waterproofing work being carried out on transport vehicles. Thousands of trucks, ambulances, tanks, and landing craft were being modified so they could survive the first moments of the invasion. Exhaust systems, engine compartments, electrical wiring, and air intakes were temporarily sealed using rubber compounds, grease, and canvas coverings. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Neither mechanic believed anything was wrong. They simply complained about impossible deadlines. Every vehicle had to be completed before the next training exercise. Margaret remembered the soldiers who had spoken about waiting inside motionless vehicles for hours. She remembered their headaches. That evening she added a new column to her notebook. Vehicle type. The information was not always available, but when patients mentioned trucks, armored personnel carriers, amphibious transports, or engineering vehicles, she recorded it. Gradually another connection appeared. Many of the soldiers had remained inside enclosed vehicles with engines running while waiting to board landing ships. She possessed no engineering knowledge. She could not explain why the detail mattered. But she had learned that observation often came before explanation. Several days later, an experienced medical officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Hawthorne arrived to review hospital administration before the expected invasion. Hawthorne had spent years overseeing military medical services in North Africa, where disease often caused more casualties than combat. He believed that unusual medical reports deserved attention. While reviewing admission statistics, he noticed Margaret comparing handwritten notes with official records after her shift had ended. Curious, he asked what she was doing. At first she hesitated. A nurse investigating operational matters could easily be viewed as stepping beyond her responsibilities. Finally she handed him the notebook. Hawthorne spent nearly 20 minutes reading every page. He asked only a few questions. Had she altered any dates?
No.
Had she copied information exactly from official records?
Yes.
Were these all separate patients?
Yes.
He thanked her and quietly took the notebook to his office. The following morning Margaret expected nothing further to happen. Instead, she found several senior medical officers examining admission files that had not been opened for weeks. No announcement was made. No one suggested she had discovered anything important. But something had changed. Within days, Hawthorne requested medical reports from two nearby military hospitals. Their records revealed similar cases. The numbers were not enormous, but they were consistent. Soldiers involved in amphibious rehearsals appeared more likely to suffer unexplained respiratory irritation and severe headaches than personnel completing ordinary field exercises. The information remained confidential. Only a handful of officers knew an investigation had begun. Military planners faced enormous pressure. Operation Overlord was approaching rapidly. Every recommendation had the potential to delay preparations. No commander wanted unnecessary complications. Still, Hawthorne believed the evidence justified further examination. Rather than reporting directly to operational headquarters, he forwarded the findings through the Army Medical Directorate, allowing engineers and medical specialists to review the issue without disrupting invasion planning. The response came